Well, I'm sorry, I should have asked this. Do you normally stand for the gospel reading? Well, wonderful. You open your hearts and minds to the word of the gospel. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will proclaim all things to us. Jesus said to her, I am he, the one who is speaking to you. Just then his disciples came. They were astonished that he was speaking with the woman, but no one said, what do you want, or why are you speaking with her? Then the woman left her water jar and went back to the city. She said to the people, come and see a man who told me everything I've ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he? They left the city and were on their way to him. I'm going to skip ahead. If it's okay with you, please skip ahead to the final paragraph on the next page. Many Samaritans from that city believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I have ever done. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them. And he stayed there 2 days, and many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, it is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this truly is the Savior of the world. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. Not to be an editor-in-chief as someone who's had my own work edited. I'm sorry to St. John who wrote this. Edit on the fly his words. I'm going to grab this mic up here for a moment. I was in a town called Betsabor at my friend Daniel Benora's house. Daniel is someone that I played ultimate frisbee with, and his family welcomed me into their home. We had arrived in Amman, Jordan, and I traveled across the Jordan River through Israeli customs into the West Bank, and Daniel's family living in Betsabor, this mostly Palestinian Christian village. And his home, very beautiful home, multi-floor, nice place. And there were artwork that some of you might be familiar with as well. There were crosses on the wall. His mother had stitched this thing that said, as for me and my house, we choose to serve the Lord. There were VeggieTales DVDs, all of these things that are familiar to many Christian families, familiar to me as someone who's been in houses like this in the United States and around the world. And in a place where I knew there was a lot of conflict and violence, there was something grounding and comfortable about being there in his home, seeing all this familiarity with folks with his family that I had not met until then. Until a couple days later. A couple days later, I was meeting with a group called the Jerusalem Legal Aid Center. This is a group of Israeli and Palestinian human rights lawyers who provide free legal services to folks in the area who need them. And they're walking us through things about land and maps and hillsides and property and dispossession, possession, and all these things that I thought I knew something about. And as they're showing us these slides, one of the slides is of this green hillside on one side and of a set of buildings on that hillside on another slide. And a new friend of mine, Sam Benayer, who is a young theologian there, who's from Jerusalem, he's a part of the Seville Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center, which is very similar to, if you remember our civil rights history, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that Dr. King and Abernathy and Shuttlesworth founded back then. So Sam says, actually, Jeff, I think that land is your friend Daniel's family's land. And I said, whoa, what, huh? Like he interrupted this presentation to say that. And I said, can you go back to that? And I took a picture of the slide and I sent the picture to Daniel and I said, hey, Sam thinks this is your family's land. And he said, yeah, that's until they took it. And being the innocent American that I am, I thought this was like some kind of eminent domain situation. And I'm like, what do you mean they took it? He said, well, they stole it, Jeff. If they hadn't stolen it, it would still be ours and my uncle would live there. And that's when the reality of the situation there changed for me. It makes me choke up to think about that. Here is this guy who I've known off and on for years, who showed me such incredible hospitality when I came there, organized a game of ultimate frisbee to play. He showed me where the good beer is in town and how to get it at a good, cheap price. He showed me original works of Banksy, the famous artist in the area. I had no idea. I didn't realize all these things we read about in the news, there are real people that are affected by the things we hear about there. I want to read some more of this passage because I think it gives such a good framework for how we understand the situation there. And I would encourage you, when you have time, to go back to John chapter 4 and read the whole chapter. It's an amazing conversation Jesus has. Earlier in the chapter, the context, this woman, like, who was she? This woman that we just read about, that went and spoke to her whole community and saw all of them change their perspective on something. Who does that? Who is she? Where's she from? What's her intentions? What's her background? Is she ordained? Does she have a degree? Like, where does she come from? At the beginning of John chapter 4 and verse 6, it says, Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, having traveled through, tired by his journey, was sitting by the well, and it was about noon. There's an important detail there, that it was about noon. You probably know this. It's warm in the middle of the day when the sun is at its highest. And people of that area, that time, women would go get their day's water from the well early in the morning. It wasn't so hot, so you didn't have to carry this water in the heat of the day. That she was there at noon becomes an important detail later on in the conversation, and why she wasn't there in the morning when all the other women would have been there. The Samaritan woman said to him, how is it that you, Jesus, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? There was ethnic tension and racism there as there is today. John comments on this and lends his own commentary, parenthetically, in the gospel writing. Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. So here is Jesus. She sees Jesus. At first, she simply refers to him as Jew. What are you doing here, Jew, in the middle of the day? I'm the only one that's supposed to be here. Jesus is talking to her, and she says to him, Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? So already in this conversation, she's moved from just some Jew to Sir. They start talking more and more about the well. How are you going to get it? The water is so deep. And I have to tell you, that water is very deep. The well is very deep. I've been to that well. It's called Jacob's Well. It's in a city called Nablus in the north of the West Bank of Palestine. And one of the things that I was asked to do is to bring young adults and college students. So we were just there this past New Year's, and there was a Georgetown University student with me, and the Russian Orthodox guy who was showing us the well at the time, he offered this up. Does any of you want to actually draw water out of the well? And the thing about this well is there are a lot of archaeological sites in the area, and let's be real, some of them are just swindlers trying to get your money. I mean, you can look at any rock and say, this is where Jesus was nursed by his mother. You can look at any place and this is where King David played ball with his son Solomon. Like, you can make up, but you can't make up a well. There's either water in the ground or there's not. And this well has been there for thousands of years, going back to the Old Testament and Jacob. Jesus there, and she notes, this is a long well. You don't have a bucket. How are you going to get water out of this well, sir? This young lady, Grace, from Georgetown University, she starts turning the wheel, sending the bucket down. And the Russian guy is really getting a kick out of this because he sees where it starts to get awkward, you know? She's still turning and turning and turning and turning until finally you hear she said she could feel the tension. And then about 2 seconds later, the sound had traveled up to where she could hear the pump. And she starts pulling the water up. And so you can actually drink water from the very well that Jesus and this woman drank from all those years ago. The church that is there has been there for about 1,700 years. It's an Orthodox church. The priest there, his name is Father Justinius. And Father Justinius, if you've seen Star Wars, he's basically Yoda. He's about this tall. He's got kind of a scraggly beard and hair thing going on, and he walks with a cane. But if you've seen Star Wars, you know that when it hits the fan, Yoda can move. Yoda is like bouncing off walls and fights his lightsabers. And when I came to the church, Justinius comes out meeting us with his cane, walking very frail. There's scaffolding about 30 feet up the front of the church. That's where he was before I arrived. He's up there doing artwork. And why are you up there? Well, I was an artist before I was a priest. And, oh, well, that's it. How did you become a priest? He said, well, I became the priest here when our previous priest was beheaded by a settler. Like, what? Beheaded? There's iconography of the previous priest who is a martyr inside the church. And just as you would see in Catholic churches where there's a halo over their head, it's not exactly the same, but similar in the Orthodox faith. And there are portraits of this priest in that church and in other churches in the region where he's laying on the ground with his body over a stump, a man standing over him with an axe, and his head with a halo hanging over on the ground. That's how Father Justinius became the priest of the church of Jacob's Well. He walks me around the property and shows me what he said at the time, and I didn't believe, quite frankly, was a tank shell lodged in the side of the wall of the church. I have a friend who's in the Marine Corps, a retired officer. He came with me on one of these trips. And so he was actually a tank officer at Fallujah when we were in Iraq. And I asked him, is there any way that could be a tank shell? He said, yeah, absolutely. It's called an M339. It's used for close quarter urban combat. And he said that's got to be what that is up in that wall. Justinius walks me around the property, and he was explaining there's a refugee camp on the other side of the street. And he's talking about the unique relationship they have there, that they've tried to serve the people there. Some of them become so desperate that they become, but generally speaking, there have been refugees there that have formed human walls, human chains around the property of the church to protect him and the parishioners. They had to put up steel doors on the outside of their property because of the amount of vandalism and violence that the church was suffering. And he shows me the steel doors, and he says, I've got 54 bullet holes in the doors of my church, Jeff. Where is your church? San Francisco, Tiburon. How many bullet holes are there in your doors of your church? How many bullet holes are there in the doors of the church of Good Shepherd? I know it's not 54. And that is when Father Justinius, this little man, grabbed me by the shoulders, looked up at me right in the eyes, could see that I was having a hard time putting all this together, and said, you need to wake up, Jeff. There will be no Christians here in 20 years unless you do something. He says that to everyone, not just me, that will listen. It is an uncomfortable truth to live with, to see how this affects people's lives on a day-to-day basis. We return to the woman at the well, the original woman. She says, Sir, to Jesus, Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Now, do you know what a prophet is? Like within the history of our faith? Now, if you ask Tessa, she could give you a brief biography on all the biblical prophets, because when I taught middle school religion here, we would spend at least a week on all the Hebrew prophets talking about what they did, what they do. The prophets are people who speak for God. They tell uncomfortable truths about who we are, about the situation where we live. They say things that do not make them popular. And we see that because it's something we talked about in the class. Like, they didn't have followers. They didn't have fans, most of them. Some of them you may be familiar with, like Daniel and the lion's den. You may have heard the story. You realize why Daniel was in a lion's den? It's because he said things that the community leaders did not like hearing. And so they had the king put him in a den of lions to be eaten. And we may think that we are so enlightened, that we are so different today. But do you know, 2 years before Dr. King was assassinated, there was a Gallup approval poll of him, where 1/3 of Americans approved of Dr. King a couple of years before he was assassinated. Prophets tell us uncomfortable things, regardless of the consequences. When I'm in Nablus, when you drive into this church in Nablus, there are these highway signs, just like the ones you see on our highway, reflected big metal signs. And it says in Hebrew, Arabic, and English, you are now entering Area A, which is forbidden Israeli citizens and dangerous to your lives. We have to go through multiple militarized checkpoints just to get to this city where this church is, where everyone's identification is checked and people are questioned. This, for the pastor Mother Isak, who has become a very well-known indigenous pastor of the region, who's part of your Lutheran denomination, actually, and was the dean of Bethlehem Bible College. He was explaining to me this makes ministry difficult. Like, he cannot get to some of the homebound seniors who want to visit from their pastor because he knows a 2-mile trip could take him over 2 hours, or it could take him half an hour, or he may be just rejected and sent back. At their church now, where he serves in Ramallah, just 8 miles from Bethlehem, they could not go to the Church of the Nativity with their youth group as they do every year because he just knew it wasn't safe to do so. One of the things he said that has struck a lot of people in the American church is, at a certain point, silence becomes complicity. That you become complicit in the war crimes and the genocide and the injustices that happen in our land when you say or do nothing. And that may be harsh. That may be the voice of a prophet. These are not my words, these are his. But it's hard to see why he would not feel that way when so many of his parishioners, people who attend churches just like yours, sing from the same hymn book, use the same liturgical books that you use, just in different language, are imprisoned, have their homes taken, have to flee because of despair, or are killed. One of the college students at Bethlehem Bible College, Lyon, she was Lyan Nasir. She, just young 20-something, was detained multiple times without charges, months in a prison without charges, then released, detained, released, detained, released, detained, and now arrested. And facing charges for being a part of a club back in 2020, which was legal then, but is illegal now. These are the charges she faces. She's not allowed to have a visit from her pastor, which she is legally authorized, which she has legal right to have. Why would this pastor, Mother Isak, this Lutheran pastor, not feel the way he does? When you go to, there's a gift shop in this refugee camp in Bethlehem, and it's a little disturbing that there's a gift shop in a refugee camp that dates back to the 1940s. But the artists have made art trying to redeem destruction into something beautiful. They've made art out of some of the exploded ordinances. And you look at these tear gas canisters that are shaped into playgrounds and these missile shells that are reshaped into swings of books. And right there, those shells say made in the USA. We are complicit in some way or another. And this is a hard truth to hold. Now, I have to get back to this reading because there's an important thing to note about this. The disciples return and they see Jesus speaking to her, and they wonder, what are you doing talking to this woman who's here in the middle of the day? Jesus says to her, notes that she's had 4 husbands. The man she's living with today is not her husband. And there have been preachers through the years who have accused this woman of some form of promiscuity. But Jesus doesn't say that. How do we not know her husband, that she's not a widow 4 times over? How do we not know that? Why have we put this accusation on her without knowing the entire situation? Maybe she simply had shame. Maybe she was introverted. Who knows why she was there at noon? But the disciples see Jesus talking to this Samaritan woman and say, what are you doing talking to this Samaritan woman? Because as John says, Jews and Samaritans do not have anything in common. I want you to know I meet with Israeli Defense Force active and formerly active soldiers. And I've met with the Israeli Committee Against Housing Demolition, Rabbis for Human Rights, other folks who see how their their faith, their Jewish identity has been used in ways that try to support death and injustice. And if you are a Christian, you may know what this feels like, because our faith has been wrongfully used to defend oppression and injustice and death as well. And so this is not about the Jewish people. This is about systemic injustice in a land being done by a government itself. There's one illustration this is probably not normal, but this is what happens when you get a youth guide. If you want, you can pull out your phone and look at this. And I can show you in a slide how this works. But if you look up Hebrew University on Google Maps, you just type in Hebrew University, it most likely takes you to the main campus on Martin Buber Road. And you do the street view, and you look around, and you will see beautiful, flowery medians, you'll see nice buildings, you'll see people walking to in and out of class. Like, it looks like a very nice Mediterranean town. Israel's beautiful. And then if you come out of street view, you will see a dotted line on the map. And if you drop your little guy on the other side of the street view and do a street view on the other side of that line, you will see garbage on the street. You see power lines going every direction. You see water tanks, big water tanks on the top of every building. Because everyone on this map that you're looking at in that space, and I'll explain later how it differs where you are, but everyone on that map that you're looking at in that small place pays taxes to the same government. But only one gets to vote in national elections, the other does not. One gets full access to water, the other does not. The other actually pays an additional surcharge to get water. One side gets full electricity rights and one does not. One gets full funding for schools and one does not. There is a highway that you'll see running between these two areas. And if you drop your little guy there, you will see on the highway there are walls on either side. This is what's commonly referred to as the apartheid wall. And I don't know what else to call it. Apartheid means to govern people apart from one another. There are two entirely different systems of justice and government right there on the little screen on your phone in that area. And again, I'll explain how it's different depending on where you are and try to sift through some of the parts where people say it's complicated. The uncomfortable truths are hard to live with. But last time we turned back to the Samaritan woman. She returns and she says, "Come and see a man who told me everything I've ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he?" This is who she is. This woman who, shunned by her community, was brave enough to talk to somebody who did not share her background, that knowing the rest of her community would judge her, and Jesus being brave enough to sit with her and talk with her when Jews and Samaritans had nothing in common. People may say Palestinians and Israelis have nothing in common. Does that matter? Does that matter when we're talking about justice and rights? There is, the last thing I will leave you with is this. It was my understanding that, we normally talk about the situation in Palestine and Israel by talking about Muslims and Jews, because we recognize they make up the majority of the people of Palestine and Israel. But there are Christians there, and they take very much pride in being known as the first Christians, dating their lineage back 2,000 years ago to the very people we read about in our Bibles. Daniel cracked me up, and I've heard of several people say this now. When he came to the U.S. to study here, people would ask him, because he's a brown-skinned Arab, "When did you become a Christian?" And he would say, I don't know, 2,000 years ago? Like, he didn't know what to say, because they would talk like that. My understanding going in was that these people do not talk, they don't get along. The understanding of the Samaritan woman was one thing, the prejudice she had, the prejudice people had about the relationship she could have with Jesus. The prejudice and the thing that I thought going in was different than the reality I found. That Palestinian Christians, indigenous Christians whose ancestry dates back hundreds and thousands of years, they're not persecuted because they're Christians. They're persecuted because they're Palestinian. And there is a difference. And just as much as there are people who have seen their Jewish identity taken over by someone who wants to use it for means of injustice, we too have seen our Christian faith appropriated for means of injustice. And so why keep doing this? Well, I leave you with a couple asks. One, pray for peace. Pray for justice. Do what Jesus said when he said, blessed are those who mourn about it, so that you may be comforted. That you may hunger and thirst for righteousness, that you may be fulfilled. But blessed are the peacemakers, not the warmongers. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. If you call yourself a children of God, then make peace. Also, we're going to take a group of young adults just in a few weeks, but the situation is too difficult to get flights in and out. So we're looking at a trip in the fall now, or winter. But next May, our church, Westminster, will be going. It will be a Westminster and Friends church. And so the same invitation that the Samaritan woman gave to her community was given to me by the community there, and is now being given to you, to come and see, so that you can eat good falafel, find the good beer, break bread and pray and worship alongside our siblings and allies in a very difficult place, so that you can bring hope just by your mere presence, so that people know they are not alone. And if you can't go, then maybe you can help others go. On behalf of the people of Seville Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center, you were asked to come and see, to go and tell, to advocate, to pray, and to talk about the uncomfortable truths of which you've heard today. And you're invited to ask whatever questions you may worry or uncomfortable. I promise you they're not now. Dan asked that you bring a robe, and I actually wear this outfit on purpose, because when I take groups through militarized checkpoints, I try to look innocent. And so this is what my group noticed. I kept wearing the same thing when we would go through checkpoints. And this became known as my sweatshirt of innocence. So you're welcome to say or ask anything, because this sweater can handle it. Amen.
Please take a moment for some silent prayer.